The morning sun cast long shadows across the Swiss meadow as Ambassador Keth stepped out of the sleek silver craft that had brought his delegation to Earth. The Rolani diplomat straightened his ceremonial robes and breathed in the crisp mountain air, feeling optimistic about this historic first contact with humanity. Behind him, 11 other alien representatives emerged from their respective vessels, each representing different species from across the Galactic Council. Keth had studied the human communication protocols carefully. The meeting location had been agreed upon through months of careful negotiation. A simple field outside Geneva, far from any major population centers, with clear sight lines and easy access for both parties. The humans had seemed reasonable in their requests, asking only for advance notice and basic security considerations. What greeted the alien delegation was anything but basic. The first thing Keth noticed was the sound. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like distant thunder that never ended. As his eyes adjusted to the Earth's bright sunlight, he began to make out the source of the noise. Vehicles, hundreds of them. Heavy metal machines, arranged in perfect formations around the perimeter of the meadow, their dark barrels pointing outward in overlapping fields of fire. "By the void," whispered Dr. Nora, the mantis-like scientist from the Chitauri Collective. "Are we under attack?" Keth shook his head slowly, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "The humans assured us this was a peaceful meeting." He activated his translation device and tried to process what he was seeing. The vehicles were clearly military in nature, but they weren't aimed at the alien ships. Instead, they seemed to be creating a defensive perimeter around the entire area, above them. The sky buzzed with activity. Small aircraft circled in precise patterns, their movements coordinated like a deadly dance. Larger flying machines held position at various altitudes, creating what appeared to be a three-dimensional web of surveillance and protection. Keth counted at least 30 aircraft visible at any given moment, though more seemed to appear and disappear at the edges of his vision. "Welcome to Earth," came a voice from behind them. The aliens turned to see a group of humans approaching across the meadow. They walked with confident strides, their bodies covered in matching dark suits that seemed both formal and practical. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings simultaneously. "I am Secretary Williams," the human said, extending his hand in the greeting gesture they had practiced. "On behalf of the United Nations and the people of Earth, I welcome you to our world." Keth reached out to accept the handshake, noting how the human's grip was firm but not crushing. "Ambassador Keth of the Rolani Federation, we are honored by your invitation." He paused, gesturing toward the massive military presence surrounding them. "Though I must ask about the extensive security measures. Are we in danger?" Secretary Williams followed Keth's gaze and seemed genuinely puzzled for a moment. "Oh, the security detail. Please don't be concerned. This is just our standard VIP protection protocol. We've actually kept it quite light for this occasion." The word light hung in the air like a physical object. Keth felt his breathing apparatus flutter with confusion. Around him, the other alien delegates were making similar sounds of bewilderment. General Vorth of the Canary military caste, arguably the most warlike species in the council, was staring at the human security arrangements with what could only be described as professional awe. "Light," Keth repeated carefully. "This is what you consider light security?" "Well, yes," Williams replied, sounding almost apologetic. "We considered bringing in the full ceremonial guard, but we thought that might be overwhelming for a first meeting." Captain Ross here, he gestured to a shorter, stockier human who had remained silent, argued for minimal presence, so we compromised. Captain Ross stepped forward with what might have been a smile. "The secretary wanted to make a good impression. I wanted to keep everyone safe." This seemed like a reasonable middle ground. Keth looked around the meadow again, trying to process what he was seeing. If this was a compromise between minimal and full security, what would full security look like? He noticed that every human in sight wore the same alert expression, their eyes constantly moving, scanning for threats that didn't exist. Even the ones who appeared to be simple diplomats moved with the fluid grace of trained warriors. "Perhaps," Keth said slowly, "you could explain your security procedures to us. In our experience, such extensive military presence is typically reserved for active war zones." Williams and Ross exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. "Of course," Williams said, "though I should mention that we're not actually military. Well, not all of us. Captain Ross is former military. But most of our security team consists of diplomatic protection specialists." The human gestured toward the perimeter, where Keth could now see figures moving with practiced efficiency. They wore different uniforms than the vehicle crews, but moved with the same lethal precision. "We have 3 overlapping security zones. The outer perimeter is handled by local law enforcement, backed up by National Guard units. The middle zone is our diplomatic security service, and the inner perimeter is handled by our special protection detail." "3 zones," General Vorth muttered in his native tongue. "They have 3 complete security zones for a peaceful meeting. The aircraft overhead are providing surveillance and rapid response capability." Williams continued, apparently not hearing the general's comment. "The ground units are positioned to respond to any potential threat from any direction. We've also got electronic warfare specialists monitoring all communications in the area, and medical teams standing by in case anyone needs assistance." Dr. Nora made a chittering sound that her translator rendered as nervous laughter. "How many humans are involved in this light security detail?" Captain Ross checked a small device on his wrist. "About 3,000, give or take. That's not counting the backup units positioned beyond visual range." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the buzz of aircraft. Keth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 3,000 humans, all armed and trained, all focused on protecting a simple diplomatic meeting. And this was their idea of restraint. "I think," Keth said carefully, "we may need to discuss human security protocols in greater detail. Our cultures seem to have very different approaches to risk assessment." Secretary Williams nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent idea. Captain Ross has prepared a full briefing on our standard operating procedures. I think you'll find our methods quite interesting." As they walked toward the human command post, Keth couldn't help but notice that even their path to the meeting area had been carefully chosen. Every step took them through overlapping fields of fire, past concealed positions, and under the watchful eyes of dozens of specialists. The humans called it light security, but it represented more military coordination than most species used. To defend their HOME-WORLDS. The real question, Keth realized, was not what humans considered adequate security. The real question was what they considered a serious threat. 3 days after the initial meeting, Ambassador Keth found himself standing in the transport bay of the R'Lani flagship, watching as the human delegation prepared to board their vessel. The cultural exchange had been planned as a gesture of goodwill, an opportunity for both species to learn about each other's way of life. Keth had been looking forward to showing the humans how civilized beings conducted themselves in space. The human team consisted of 12 individuals, led by Captain Ross and including Secretary Williams. What struck Keth immediately was their equipment. While the aliens wore simple, comfortable clothing suitable for shipboard life, the humans appeared to be dressed for war. Each wore some kind of protective vest beneath their formal jackets, and Keth could see the subtle bulges that suggested concealed weapons. "Is there something we should know about?" Keth asked as Captain Ross approached the airlock. "Some threat we haven't been informed of?" Ross looked genuinely confused. "Threat? No, Ambassador, this is standard diplomatic dress. We always maintain basic protective equipment when visiting foreign vessels." He gestured to his team. "Though we've kept it minimal out of respect for your customs." Keth felt that familiar flutter of confusion. Minimal again. That word seemed to mean something very different to humans than it did to everyone else in the galaxy. The tour began in the R'Lani flagship's main corridor, a broad, open space with high ceilings and gentle lighting. The walls were decorated with artwork from across the Federation, and comfortable seating areas were scattered throughout for informal meetings and relaxation. It represented centuries of peaceful cooperation and trust between species, the humans. Reaction was immediate and disturbing. Instead of admiring the artwork or commenting on the open, welcoming design, they began what could only be described as a tactical assessment. Captain Ross positioned himself where he could observe both directions of the corridor simultaneously. Other members of his team spread out along the walls, their eyes constantly moving, cataloging every door, every intersection, every potential hiding spot. "Beautiful craftsmanship," Secretary Williams commented, but even he seemed more interested in the structural elements of the walls than their artistic value. "How thick are these bulkheads?" "About 3 inches of composite material," Keth replied. "Sufficient for atmospheric containment and basic protection from space debris?" One of the humans, a woman introduced as Agent Park, made a note on a small device. "No reinforcement? No armor plating? Why would we need armor?" Dr. Nora asked, "This is a diplomatic vessel. We're not expecting to be shot at." The humans exchanged those meaningful looks again. Keth was beginning to recognize the expression as something between pity and disbelief. As they moved deeper into the ship, the human behavior became more pronounced. They checked every doorway before entering, automatically positioned themselves with clear escape routes, and seemed to be memorizing the layout with military precision. When they reached the ship's command center, their reaction was even more extreme. The R'Lani Bridge was designed around the principle of open cooperation. The captain's position was in the center of a circular room, with all stations facing inward, to facilitate communication and shared decision-making. Large windows provided a beautiful view of space, and the overall atmosphere was one of calm professionalism. "Where are your defensive positions?" Ross asked immediately. "Defensive positions?" Captain Halley, the ship's commander, seemed genuinely puzzled. "This is the bridge. We coordinate the ship's operations from here." "But if you're boarded," Agent Park pressed, "where do you make your stand? Where are your weapons lockers? Your armor stations?" Captain Hale's expression shifted to something approaching alarm. "We don't expect to be boarded. This is a diplomatic mission. We carry no weapons beyond small arms for the security detail." The silence that followed was perhaps the loudest thing Keth had ever heard. "No weapons," Ross said slowly. "You're in deep space, surrounded by unknown species, carrying diplomatic personnel from 12 different worlds, and you have no weapons." "We have our escort vessels," Halley replied defensively. 2 light cruisers with standard armament." "2 ships," one of the humans muttered, "for a diplomatic convoy." The cultural exchange continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The humans seemed to be viewing everything through the lens of tactical vulnerability. They asked questions about emergency procedures, backup systems, and contingency plans that the aliens had never considered necessary when it came time to return the favor. Keth approached the human vessel with growing trepidation. The ship that had brought the human delegation to the meeting was described as a diplomatic transport. But even from the outside it looked wrong. Where the alien ships had smooth, elegant lines designed for efficiency and beauty, the human vessel was angular and aggressive, with what appeared to be heavy armor plating and suspicious bulges that could only be weapon systems. "Welcome aboard." "The Meridian," Secretary Williams said as they entered the airlock. "She's one of our newer diplomatic vessels." The first thing Keth noticed was how confined everything felt. The corridors were narrow, with reinforced walls and heavy doors that sealed with an ominous hiss. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows, and the air itself seemed to carry a sense of barely contained violence. "This is your diplomatic ship," General Vorth said, running his hand along a wall that was clearly armored. "How thick are these bulkheads?" "Standard armor plating," Captain Ross replied casually. "About 8 inches of composite ceramic and steel, rated for most small arms fire and explosive devices." Dr. Nora made that chittering sound again. "You armor your diplomatic ships against explosive devices?" "You don't," Ross replied. And it wasn't a question. The tour continued through spaces that seemed designed more for combat than diplomacy. The bridge was a fortress with armored stations, redundant systems, and weapon controls that the humans claimed were just for emergencies. The crew quarters were Spartanly functional, with reinforced doors and what appeared to be personal weapon storage in every room. "Are you expecting to be attacked?" Keth asked as they stood in what the humans called the secure conference room, a space that looked more like a bunker than a meeting area. "Not specifically," Williams replied, "but we prepare for the possibility. It's better to have defenses you don't need than to need defenses you don't have." The philosophy was so alien to Keth that he struggled to process it. The humans lived in a state of constant readiness for violence, even in their most peaceful endeavors. Their diplomatic ship was more heavily armed than most military vessels in the Galactic Council. As the tour concluded, Keth found himself in the ship's armory, staring at enough weapons to equip a small army. "This is for a diplomatic mission," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Standard equipment," Ross confirmed. "Though we've kept it light for this mission. Usually we'd carry heavier ordnance." Light. There was that word again. Keth looked around the room full of weapons that could level a small city and wondered what the humans considered heavy ordnance. The cultural exchange was over, but the real education was just beginning. The humans didn't just prepare for conflict. They assumed it was inevitable. Their entire civilization seemed built around the idea that peace was temporary and violence was always. Just one mistake away, as the alien delegation returned to their own ships, Keth couldn't shake the feeling that they had just been visited by the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The terrifying part wasn't that humans were aggressive. It was that they were polite, reasonable, and utterly convinced that their approach to security was normal. The real question was no longer what humans considered adequate security. The real question was what had made them this way, and whether the rest of the galaxy was prepared for the answer. The incident began with something so trivial that Ambassador Keth would later struggle to explain how it had escalated so quickly. Junior diplomat Finn from the Yuan Council had been examining a human communication device during a routine tour of Earth's diplomatic facilities. The device was a simple tablet computer, something the humans used for basic record-keeping and translation services. Finn had always been curious about alien technology, and the humans had seemed happy to share their knowledge. He was attempting to understand the device's interface when his manipulator appendage, designed for his species' unique physiology, applied too much pressure to the screen. The device cracked with a sharp sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet conference room. "Oh no," Finn said immediately, his translator rendering his distress in perfect English. "I am so sorry. I will replace this immediately." The human technician who had been demonstrating the device smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry about it. These things happen. Let me just call for a replacement." What happened next would be debated in diplomatic circles for years to come. The technician activated his communication device and said, "Control, we have a damaged tablet in conference room 7, requesting replacement." Within 30 seconds, the room's lights shifted to a harsh, white emergency setting. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridors outside, and Keth could hear the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. The conference room doors sealed with a solid thunk that suggested they were now locked from the outside. "Security to conference room 7, came a voice over the intercom. "Please remain calm and stay in your current positions." Finn's eye stalks drooped with confusion. "I only broke a communication device." "Why are there security protocols?" The human technician looked equally puzzled, but for different reasons. "Standard operating procedure," he said, though his voice carried a note of apology. "Any equipment failure during a diplomatic meeting triggers a security assessment. They need to determine if it was accidental or intentional." "Intentional," Keth repeated slowly. "You think we might have sabotaged a tablet computer?" Before the technician could respond, the doors unsealed and a team of humans entered the room. They moved with the fluid coordination that Keth had learned to associate with human military operations. The team leader, a stern woman with sharp eyes, began scanning the room with various devices while her team took positions around the perimeter. "Agent Torres, Diplomatic Security," she announced, We need to assess the situation. Sir, she addressed the technician, please describe exactly what happened. The technician explained the accident in precise detail while Agent Torres examined. The broken device? Other team members were scanning the aliens with handheld instruments, checking for residual energy signatures, chemical traces, and other potential indicators of hostile intent. It was clearly an accident, the technician concluded. The device simply cracked under pressure. Agent Torres nodded but continued her assessment. We need to verify that no classified information was compromised and that no hostile code was introduced into our systems. She looked at Finn with professional courtesy. I'm sure you understand the precautions. Finn did not understand the precautions. None of the aliens did. In their experience, a broken piece of equipment was simply replaced, not subjected to a forensic investigation that seemed to assume hostile intent. How long will this take? Keth asked carefully. Standard assessment is 30 minutes, Agent Torres replied. However, given the diplomatic nature of this meeting, we've called in additional specialists. Should be complete within the hour. An hour for a broken tablet. Keth felt that familiar sense of disconnection from human logic. Around him, the other alien delegates were showing signs of stress. Dr. Nora's chittering had taken on a distinctly agitated tone, and General Vorth was unconsciously shifting into a defensive posture. The situation deteriorated when the human additional specialists arrived. What had been a simple security assessment became something resembling a full-scale investigation. Technical experts examined every piece of equipment in the room. Electronic warfare specialists swept for surveillance devices, even a bomb disposal. Expert appeared, though no one could explain why explosive ordnance might be relevant to a cracked tablet. This is excessive, General Vorth said finally, his translator making his words sound more aggressive than intended. We are diplomatic guests, not prisoners. The human's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The room's atmosphere shifted from professional courtesy to barely contained tension. Agent Torres positioned herself between the general and the exit, while her team members subtly adjusted their positions to maintain overlapping fields of fire. Sir, Agent Torres said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, I need you to remain calm and cooperative. We're following standard protocols to ensure everyone's safety. Safety from what? General Vorth demanded. From a broken communication device? From whatever caused the device to fail, Agent Torres replied. Until we determine the cause, we have to assume hostile intent. The words hung in the air like a physical barrier. The humans assumed hostile intent. Not equipment failure, not simple accidents, but deliberate sabotage. They lived in a world where every mishap was potentially an attack, every mistake a possible threat. Outside the conference room, Keth could hear more activity. Heavy footsteps, radio chatter, and what sounded like additional security teams being deployed. The humans weren't just investigating a broken tablet. They were treating it as a potential security breach that could threaten the entire diplomatic mission. Alert status has been elevated, came an announcement over the intercom. All diplomatic personnel are to remain in secure areas until further notice. Keth realized with growing horror that the entire diplomatic complex was now on lockdown. Hundreds of humans were responding to what he knew was nothing more than an accident. The scale of their reaction was so disproportionate to the actual threat that he wondered if they were responding to some other crisis entirely. Agent Torres, he said carefully, perhaps we could contact Secretary Williams or Captain Ross. They could verify that this was simply an accident. Secretary Williams is in the command center coordinating the response, Torres replied. Captain Ross is conducting a facility-wide security sweep. They're taking this very seriously. That was the problem. The humans were taking this very seriously. An accident that would have been forgotten in minutes aboard any alien vessel had become a major security incident requiring the attention of senior leadership and dozens of specialists. The investigation continued for 2 hours. The broken tablet was subjected to analysis that would have been appropriate for an alien artifact or a terrorist device. The room was scanned for traces of explosive residue, biological agents, and electronic surveillance equipment. The aliens themselves were subjected to additional security screening that bordered on interrogation. When the all-clear was finally given, Agent Torres seemed genuinely apologetic. "Thank you for your patience. We've determined that this was indeed an accidental equipment failure. No hostile intent detected." The relief in the room was palpable, but Keth felt more disturbed than reassured. The humans had needed 2 hours and dozens of specialists to reach a conclusion that should have been obvious from the beginning. They had treated their diplomatic guests like potential terrorists because of a broken tablet. "Does this happen often?" Dr. Nora asked as the security teams finally departed. "Equipment failures?" the technician asked. "Sometimes. But we always investigate. Better safe than sorry. Better safe than sorry." The human philosophy in 4 words. They would rather assume the worst about every situation than risk being caught unprepared. They would rather treat friends like enemies than lower their guard for even a moment. As the aliens were escorted back to their quarters, Keth noticed that the security presence throughout the facility had been increased. Guards who had been discreet were now visible at every intersection. Surveillance equipment that had been hidden was now openly displayed. The humans had used the incident as justification to reveal more of their defensive capabilities. The most disturbing part was that none of the humans seemed to think this was unusual. They had responded to a minor accident with military precision and overwhelming force, and they considered it routine. Their entire civilization was built around the assumption that any moment could bring catastrophe, and they were prepared to treat every situation as if it were life and death. That night, as Keth tried to process what had happened, he realized that the humans hadn't just overreacted to a broken tablet. They had demonstrated something far more frightening. They had shown that they were psychologically incapable of distinguishing between minor incidents and major threats. In their minds, everything was a potential crisis, and every crisis required maximum response. The aliens had come to Earth seeking peaceful relations with a new species. Instead, they had discovered a civilization that treated peace like a temporary ceasefire and every interaction like a potential battle. The humans called it being prepared. The aliens were beginning to call it something else entirely. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened aboard the neutral vessel Harmony. 3 days after what human reports called the diplomatic incident and alien records described as the tablet crisis, Ambassador Keth found himself facing a circular chamber filled with representatives from across the galaxy, all seeking answers to the same questions that had been keeping him awake since the incident. Elder Max of the Yulon species presided over the emergency session. The Yulon were known throughout the galaxy as the most militaristic race in the Council, their entire culture built around concepts of honor, combat, and warrior tradition. If anyone could understand the human approach to security, it would be Elder Max. "The Council recognizes Ambassador Keth," Elder Max announced, his voice carrying the authority of countless battles. "You will explain why the human species appears to consider a broken communication device grounds for military action." Keth rose from his position, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. "Honored Elder, I believe we are dealing with a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. What we witnessed was not aggression or paranoia, but something far more complex." "Complex how?" demanded Representative Zara of the Mintari Trade Federation. "They locked down an entire diplomatic facility because of an accident. They subjected our people to interrogation procedures typically reserved for war criminals. How is this complex?" General Vorth, who had been present during the incident, stood to address the chamber. "With respect, Representative Zara, I have commanded military forces in 3 border conflicts. I have never seen security procedures as comprehensive as what the humans consider routine diplomatic protection." Elder Max leaned forward, his scarred features showing interest. "Explain." "Their response time was under 30 seconds, General Vorth continued. "Their coordination was flawless. Their equipment was military grade, but their personnel moved like this was completely normal. They weren't responding to a crisis. They were following established protocols that assume every situation is a potential crisis. Dr. Nora chittered nervously. But why? What could have shaped a species to think this way? Before anyone could answer, the chamber's communication system activated. Elder Max, we have received a request from the human delegation. Secretary Williams and Captain Ross are requesting permission to address the council. The chamber fell silent. In the 1,000-year history of the Galactic Council, no non-member species had ever addressed an emergency session. The request was unprecedented, potentially dangerous, and absolutely fascinating. Granted, Elder Max said after a moment. But they will submit to full security screening. They have already submitted to full security screening, came the reply. They arrived with a single escort vessel and submitted to complete disarmament without protest. They are currently in the diplomatic holding area. The ease with which the humans had submitted to Council security procedures was almost as disturbing as their own security obsessions. They had accepted disarmament and isolation without question, as if they were accustomed to operating in environments where they were completely vulnerable. Minutes later, Secretary Williams and Captain Ross entered the chamber. They moved with the same alert confidence that Kef had learned to associate with human behavior, their eyes automatically cataloging exits, positions, and potential threats even in the Council's most secure facility. Honored representatives, Secretary Williams began, we understand there has been some confusion about our security procedures. We hope to provide clarification. Clarification would be welcome, Elder Max replied. Begin with why you consider a broken communication device sufficient cause for military mobilization. Williams and Ross exchanged one of their meaningful looks. May I ask, Williams said carefully, what your species considers appropriate response? To an unknown equipment failure during sensitive diplomatic negotiations? Investigation by technical personnel, Representative Zara replied immediately. Replacement of the damaged equipment. Perhaps an incident report if the failure was unusual. How long would this take? Captain Ross asked. Minutes, General Vorth answered. At most, an hour if the equipment was critical, and if the equipment failure was intentional? Ross continued. If it was the first stage of an assassination, attempt, or a cover for the introduction of surveillance devices, or a distraction while other hostile actions were being prepared. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. The humans had just outlined scenarios that hadn't occurred to any of the assembled representatives. You assume deliberate sabotage, Elder Max said slowly. You assume that every accident might be an attack. We assume that accidents are accidents until proven otherwise, Williams replied. But we prepare for the possibility that they're not. The difference is that we investigate every possibility simultaneously rather than sequentially. Dr. Nora made her chittering sound. But the scale of your response. Hundreds of personnel, hours of investigation, facility-wide lockdown. How do you justify such measures? Captain Ross stepped forward. May I tell you about human history? The request was so unexpected that Elder Max approved it before considering the implications. What followed was a presentation that changed every alien's understanding of the human species. Humans have been fighting wars for our entire recorded history, Ross began. Not occasional conflicts or border disputes, but constant, brutal warfare. That has shaped every aspect of our civilization. We have fought wars over resources, territory, ideology, religion, and sometimes for no reason other than the fact that we were different from each other. The chamber listened in growing horror as Ross described millennia of human conflict. Species extinction events caused by other humans, weapons capable of destroying entire planets, civilizations that had risen and fallen based on their ability to outfight, outthink, or outlast their enemies. We developed nuclear weapons, Ross continued, and immediately began planning how to use them against each other. We created biological weapons that could kill every living thing on our planet. We invented computer viruses that could cripple entire civilizations. And we did all of this while fighting ourselves. By the void, whispered Representative Zara. How did you survive? By assuming that every piece was temporary, Williams answered. by treating every negotiation as a potential trap, by preparing for the worst possible outcome of every situation. The humans who survived were the ones who could not be caught off guard. Elder Max was silent for a long moment. As a warrior, he understood the logic, but the scale was beyond anything his species had ever experienced. You prepare for wars that have not yet begun. We prepare for wars that may never begin, Ross confirmed, because the alternative is extinction. The chamber struggled to process this information. A species that had survived by becoming so militarized that they could not conceive of true peace. A civilization that had turned paranoia into a survival mechanism and elevated it to an art form. Your security measures, Elder Max said finally, they are not aggression, they are fear. They are prudence, Williams corrected gently. We have learned that the cost of being wrong is usually death. So we have become very, very careful about being wrong. The implications were staggering. The humans were not a warrior species like the Yilon who fought for honor and glory. They were a survivor species who had learned to fight because the alternative was extinction. They had weaponized caution and turned preparation into a religion. What do you want from us? Elder Max asked. Understanding, Williams replied. We know our methods seem extreme, but they are the result of 10,000 years of learning that the universe is not a safe place. We hope that our differences can be bridged through patience and communication. As the session concluded, Keth found himself looking at the humans with new eyes. They were not monsters or aggressors. They were survivors shaped by a history so violent that it had left them psychologically incapable of assuming good intentions. They had evolved beyond paranoia into something approaching complete preparation. The terrifying part was not that they were dangerous. The terrifying part was that they might be right. 6 months after the emergency council session, Ambassador Keth stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed diplomatic station Alpha, watching as the most unusual treaty signing in galactic history took place. The station itself was a marvel of compromise, designed jointly by human and alien engineers to accommodate both species. Radically different approaches to security and diplomacy. The human sections of the station were built like fortresses, with redundant systems, armored bulkheads, and enough defensive capabilities to withstand a small war. The alien sections were open and welcoming, with transparent walls, comfortable gathering spaces, and an atmosphere of trust and cooperation. Where the two sections met, the architecture became a fascinating blend of paranoid preparation and optimistic openness. It's remarkable, Dr. Nora commented, her chittering having evolved into something almost resembling human laughter. 6 months ago, we thought they were insane. Now we're building joint facilities that assume they might be right. The revelation of human history had changed everything. The Galactic Council had spent weeks reviewing their own security protocols, their diplomatic procedures, and their assumptions about the nature of civilized behavior. The results had been disturbing. In the past 1,000 years, the Council had prevented exactly 3 major conflicts through diplomatic intervention. In the same period, they had failed to prevent 17 smaller wars, lost contact with 4 entire species, and been completely surprised by every major crisis they had faced. Their approach to security, based on trust and good intentions, had a failure rate that would have been catastrophic by human standards. The humans were right about one thing, Elder Max had admitted during a private conversation. We have been lucky. Our peaceful approach has worked because we have been facing civilized opponents who shared our values. But what happens when we encounter something that doesn't? The question had been answered sooner than anyone expected. 3 months after the emergency session, the Council had made contact with the Devourers, a species that viewed other civilizations as nothing more than resources to be consumed. The Council's initial diplomatic overture had been met with the complete destruction of the diplomatic vessel and the massacre of everyone aboard. The humans' response had been swift and decisive. Within hours of learning about the attack, they had deployed a fleet that the Council hadn't even known existed. The Devourer incursion was stopped, their ships destroyed, and their follow-up attacks prevented by human forces that seemed to materialize from nowhere. How long have you been prepared for this? Elder Max had asked Captain Ross after the crisis. Since we learned about the Galactic Council, Ross had replied. We started planning for the possibility of hostile alien contact the moment we knew other species existed. The Devourer attack pattern was actually one of our more optimistic scenarios. The implications were staggering. While the Council had been planning diplomatic receptions and cultural exchanges, the humans had been preparing for alien invasion. They had constructed defensive fleets, developed new weapons, and created strategic plans for conflicts that didn't yet exist, but the most remarkable thing was what had happened next. After defeating the Devourers, the humans had immediately offered to share their defensive technologies with the Council. They had proposed joint training programs, mutual defense agreements, and cooperative security protocols. They had turned their paranoid preparation into a foundation for genuine partnership. You saved us, Representative Zara had said during the treaty negotiations. Without your intervention, the Devourers would have destroyed dozens of worlds. We saved ourselves, Secretary Williams had corrected. The Devourers would have come for us eventually. It was easier to stop them while we had allies. Even their altruism was strategic. The humans had helped the Council not out of pure goodwill, but because they recognized that cooperative defense was more effective than isolated preparation. They had weaponized friendship as efficiently as they had weaponized everything else. Now, as Keth watched the treaty signing ceremony, he reflected on how much had changed. The Human Galactic Defense Treaty established the first truly integrated security system in galactic history. Human tactical doctrine would be taught alongside alien diplomatic theory. Human defensive technologies would be shared with species that had never built a weapon of war. And alien cultural expertise would help humans learn to distinguish between genuine threats and imaginary ones. The ceremony itself was a perfect example of the new partnership. The signing took place in the alien section of the station with its open architecture and welcoming atmosphere. But the security was purely human, with overlapping defensive systems and contingency plans that assumed anything could go wrong at any moment. Do you think it will work? Dr. Nora asked as the various ambassadors signed the treaty documents. It has to work, Elder Max replied. The humans have shown us that the universe is more dangerous than we believed. We can either adapt to that reality or be destroyed by it. The treaty itself was a remarkable document. It established protocols for joint military operations, shared intelligence gathering, and cooperative threat assessment. But more importantly, it created a framework for understanding between species with fundamentally different worldviews. The humans would continue to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The aliens would continue to seek peaceful solutions, while acknowledging that some problems could not be solved through diplomacy. Together, they would create something new, a civilization that was both cautious and optimistic, defensive and welcoming. As the ceremony concluded, Keth found himself standing next to Captain Ross, watching as the various delegations mingled in the station's common area. The humans moved with their characteristic alertness, but they were also genuinely engaging with alien representatives, sharing stories and learning about different cultures. Do you think we can learn to trust each other? Keth asked. Ross was quiet for a moment, his eyes automatically scanning the room for potential threats even as he engaged in casual conversation. Trust is a luxury, he said finally. We'll start with mutual respect and shared interest. Trust can come later if we survive long enough to develop it. The human philosophy in one sentence. They would build relationships based on practical cooperation rather than emotional connection. They would work together because it was effective, not because they felt warm and fuzzy about each other. It was a cold approach to diplomacy, but it was also honest and potentially more durable than relationships based on sentiment alone. The Devourers were not the only threat out there, Ross continued. Our deep space sensors have detected at least 3 other potentially hostile civilizations. There are probably more we haven't found yet. The words sent a chill through Keth, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. The humans were already preparing for the next crisis, the next war, the next existential threat. They would be ready when it came, because they were always ready. As the celebration continued around them, Keth realized that the treaty signing was not really an ending, but a beginning. The humans had not just joined the galactic community, they had fundamentally changed it. They had introduced concepts of strategic thinking, worst-case planning, and defensive preparation that would reshape how every species approached security and diplomacy. The aliens had wanted to welcome humanity into their peaceful civilization. Instead, they had discovered that peace was not a natural state but a temporary condition that required constant vigilance to maintain. The humans had not brought war to the galaxy, but they had brought the tools and mindset necessary to prevent it. In the end, the treaty had a simple message that would echo through galactic history. The humans called it overkill, but the aliens had learned to call it survival. And in a universe full of unknown threats and hostile civilizations, survival was the most precious gift one species could offer another.